The trouble began long before I realized just how coordinated the HOA's actions were. At first, everything felt like the usual petty HOA drama, letters about minor violations, warnings about insignificant details, and an increasing sense that the board was monitoring my property more than anyone else's. It all seemed annoying but harmless. What I did not know was that these little actions were the first signs of something deeper, something larger, something the HOA had spent years trying to keep hidden. The small cracks in their system were already showing, but I didn't yet understand what they meant. My home sat on a quiet corner of a neighborhood that had grown steadily more upscale over the years. Properties had doubled in value, new homeowners were pouring in, and the HOA had grown more territorial, acting less like a community group and more like a private enforcement agency. They treated the neighborhood as if it were their personal kingdom, and they behaved as if the homes belonged to them rather than the people paying mortgages on them. For months, they had been tightening their grip. More inspections, more warnings, more penalties. Every homeowner whispered about how the board seemed to be building something behind the scenes, some new program, some new financial project, some new initiative they refused to openly discuss. But no one dared push back. People feared penalties, lawsuits, or being forced into compliance through relentless fines. I only became their main target after refusing a suspicious beautification fee that appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't part of the official bylaws, it wasn't approved through a vote, and the amount didn't match any previous HOA expense. When I asked for documentation, the board simply sent me another notice, this one more threatening than the last. They demanded payment, claiming my refusal interfered with the community's progress. The vague wording alone made it clear something wasn't right. Soon after that, the pressure escalated quickly. New violations appeared weekly. They cited me for issues that didn't exist, and even for things that were physically impossible. They fined me for a tree they claimed I removed, even though the tree had never existed in the first place. They accused me of altering my garage door without approval, even though it hadn't been touched in years. They sent photos as proof, but the images were heavily cropped, edited, and inconsistent. The harassment grew so intense that neighbors began avoiding me, worried that being on my side would put them in the HOA's crosshairs too. I felt like the HOA wasn't trying to correct anything, they were trying to break me. The more I resisted, the stronger their push became. The board president, a woman who acted as if she ruled the entire neighborhood, visited my property repeatedly. She inspected everything from my trash cans to my garden bed. She took photos constantly, even when I hadn't changed anything. Her presence was suffocating, and she seemed unnaturally invested in forcing me into submission. Something about her behavior didn't feel personal, it felt strategic, calculated, and motivated by something bigger. By the time the third month of harassment arrived, I realized the HOA wasn't simply trying to punish me. They were trying to force me into a corner. Their actions weren't random. They were systematic. They were attempting to push me out, or at least push me far enough that I would agree to something without fighting back. But their biggest mistake was assuming I would break instead of dig deeper. One afternoon, after yet another violation letter arrived, this time accusing me of unauthorized soil displacement, I noticed something unusual. The letterhead was slightly different than previous ones, and the signature on the document was not the board president's, despite her being the one who supposedly approved it. The paper looked rushed, mismatched, and out of place. It sparked a suspicion I hadn't considered before, perhaps these letters weren't just harassment. Perhaps someone was forging documents. With that thought in mind, I began collecting every notice, every fine, every inspection photo, and every piece of paper they'd ever sent. I organized them into folders, comparing signatures, dates, and formatting. It didn't take long to spot inconsistencies. Dates that didn't align with meeting schedules. Signatures that didn't match official documents. Fines that didn't appear in the community's financial records. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that these weren't mistakes, they were intentional. Someone inside the HOA was generating documents off the books. When I brought these concerns to a former board member, someone who had quietly resigned months earlier, his reaction told me everything. His face shifted. His voice dropped. He avoided eye contact, and he offered only vague warnings. He didn't deny what I was suggesting. In fact, he hinted at something far more alarming. He said there were reasons he stepped down, reasons he didn't want to discuss. He urged me to be careful, to stop digging, to let things be. But his warning only confirmed the truth. The HOA was hiding something big. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that they had every reason to silence anyone who questioned them. The random fines weren't random at all, they were smokescreens. The harassment wasn't petty, it was strategic. They were trying to distract homeowners from noticing something much more dangerous happening in the background. The final clue came from an unexpected discovery. While reviewing old neighborhood newsletters stored in a forgotten community forum, I found an outdated financial summary from years ago. It contained a line item labeled, Private Development Reserve Fund. The amount listed was staggering, millions of dollars. But what made my stomach drop was what came next, a note stating that the fund would be used for a long-term property acquisition initiative. But the next year's newsletter showed no mention of the fund. The year after that, nothing. Every reference to it had vanished. A multi-million-dollar fund had disappeared from records without explanation. That's when I understood the truth. The HOA wasn't harassing me for fun, they were trying to protect a secret that was worth far more than any fine or violation they could issue. A secret worth millions. And they knew I was getting close. As the weight of my discovery sank in, I realized there was no turning back. The HOA had pushed me too far, and now I had something they feared, evidence. But they didn't know that yet. They still believed they had control. They had no idea my next move would expose everything they tried to bury, including a $10 million secret. As I closed my folders and prepared for what came next, I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory. But I also knew one thing for certain, the HOA had chosen the wrong homeowner to push. The real battle was about to begin. The night after uncovering the vanished financial records, I barely slept. Every document I had collected, every odd inconsistency, every desperate tactic the HOA used against me, it all connected now. Their behavior made sense only if they had something enormous to lose. Something they were willing to protect through lies, harassment, forged documents, and intimidation. Something that could destroy the board if exposed. By morning, I knew what I needed to do, trace where the missing fund went. I didn't have access to official HOA files, but former board members often left breadcrumbs without realizing it. Old meeting logs, community newsletters, archived financial summaries, forgotten emails, these were scattered across old neighborhood forums, cloud folders, and resident message boards that no one bothered to delete. I spent hours combing through everything, cross-referencing dates and names. Patterns slowly emerged. The Private Development Reserve Fund appeared abruptly, grew quietly, then vanished without explanation. Every document surrounding it contained the same three names, the board president, the treasurer, and a former vice president who had moved away under suspicious circumstances. They had crafted the fund under the guise of property improvement, but nothing in the neighborhood had been improved during those years. No major projects, no renovations, no new facilities. The money had gone somewhere else. Somewhere they didn't want anyone to look. Every time I found a hint of the fund, I found evidence of its erasure. PDFs replaced with newer versions. Lines deleted from newsletters. Records moved to private board archives that regular homeowners weren't allowed to access. It was systematic, intentional, and almost flawless. Almost. Buried inside an outdated meeting agenda, something the HOA had long forgotten to purge, I found a reference to a miscellaneous land negotiation report. The meeting never happened because it had been postponed indefinitely. But the agenda included one significant detail: the HOA had been in talks with a private development company that specialized in luxury commercial properties. Why would a neighborhood HOA negotiate with a commercial developer? The answer was unsettling. If the HOA had been planning to sell parcels of community-owned land, or even entire sections of the neighborhood, they could have profited enormously, without homeowners ever knowing. And if they'd already sold something, if they'd already taken money under the table, then the missing $10 million wasn't missing at all. It was stolen. The more I uncovered, the clearer their motives became. They didn't just want to silence homeowners, they needed to silence anyone who might stumble too close to what they had done. And I had already seen too much. The harassment campaign intensified almost immediately after I discovered this new trail. Daily violation notices. Threats of liens. Warnings about non-compliance. A letter implying legal action. It was all coordinated, predictable, and increasingly desperate. But fear wasn't going to stop me. It only proved I was right. Neighbors who once kept their distance began quietly sharing their own stories. Misplaced dues. Unauthorized charges. Strange new fees that never appeared again. Homeowners who asked questions were always shut down, fined, or pressured into backing off. Several admitted they had suspected corruption but didn't think anyone else noticed. One couple confided that they'd seen board members meeting with strangers late at night in the clubhouse. Another remembered seeing boxes of files removed from the HOA office after a surprise audit years ago. The audit vanished just like the fund. Every rumor, every strange detail, every frightened whisper was another puzzle piece falling into place. The HOA wasn't just incompetent, they were hiding a massive financial crime. But even with everything I had, I needed proof. Evidence strong enough to expose the board in a way they couldn't deny, suppress, or twist into something else. Something undeniable. Something that would crack their polished facade and reveal what they had buried beneath years of intimidation. The opportunity came unexpectedly. One morning, while the HOA president conducted yet another aggressive inspection of my property, I noticed her carrying a leather binder. It was oversized, bulky, and worn, out of place compared to the clean, digital tablets the board usually used. She guarded it closely, tucking it under her arm whenever she moved, snapping it shut whenever someone walked by. Something about it felt important. When she left, I followed her at a distance through the neighborhood. She walked to the HOA office building, normally locked, restricted, and only accessible to board members. But something distracted her before she went inside. She received a call, stepped away from the door, and opened the binder to reference something inside. Papers fluttered with movement. Charts. Tables. Signatures. And in the middle, one sheet marked with the same line item I had spent weeks chasing, Private Development Reserve Fund. My heart pounded as she abruptly closed the binder and entered the office. But not before I observed two crucial details: she had left the office door unlocked, and she had stepped away far enough that she couldn't see inside. This was my chance. I slipped inside quietly. The room smelled of dust and chemical cleaner, the result of constant attempts to erase old paper trails. Filing cabinets lined the walls, many empty, many locked. But the real treasure sat on the middle of the desk, folders stacked in uneven piles, marked only by years and vague descriptions. The folders were filled with drafts of financial reports, actual figures crossed out, replaced with cleaner, more polished versions. Signed documents that never reached homeowners. Contracts with development companies worth millions. Letters discussing land sales, contingent on secrecy. It was all there, scattered and unprotected. I photographed everything. Every page. Every signature. Every dollar moved behind our backs. As I worked, adrenaline forced me to stay calm, precise, deliberate. This was evidence enough to dismantle the entire board. Evidence they never expected anyone to find. Evidence that could expose everything they had done. But just as I snapped a photo of a particularly damning contract, footsteps echoed from outside. The board president had returned. The binder was still in her hands. Her shadow stretched across the office doorway. I had what I needed, but escaping without being caught would be another battle entirely. And the moment her hand gripped the doorframe, I knew the next chapter of this conflict would be far more dangerous than anything before. Because now the HOA wasn't just suspicious. They knew someone was after their $10 million secret. And they were ready to protect it at any cost. The moment the HOA president's shadow stretched into the doorway, I felt the weight of everything I had uncovered press against my chest. The binder she carried held the last missing pieces of the puzzle, but the evidence I had already collected in the office was more than enough to expose the entire operation. What I needed now wasn't more information, it was a clean exit. I slipped behind one of the tall filing cabinets as she entered the office. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, and too controlled to be casual. She placed the binder on the desk, its heavy covers landing with a thud that echoed through the small room. Papers rustled as she flipped through them, muttering sharply under her breath. I realized instantly that she was searching for something, one of the files I had moved. And she knew someone had been inside. My heart thudded loudly in my ears as she paced the room, inspecting every drawer, every stack of papers, every detail she believed only she touched. Her paranoia was palpable. She wasn't acting like someone who feared a small violation, she was acting like someone terrified of being exposed, someone guarding a secret worth millions. After several tense minutes, she stepped outside again, speaking hurriedly to someone over the phone. The conversation was muffled, but I heard enough to know things were escalating. She was calling an emergency board meeting. And whatever they planned next would be a retaliation, not a defense. That was the moment I made my move. I slipped out the back exit of the building, keeping to the narrow alley between the office and the maintenance shed. I moved quickly and quietly, avoiding the main path where she now stood with two other board members. They looked nervous, glancing around the neighborhood as though expecting someone to leap from the shadows. In a way, they were right, but not in the way they thought. By the time I reached home, I had already uploaded all the photos to a secure cloud drive. Every contract. Every financial discrepancy. Every erasure. Every hidden negotiation with developers. I backed up everything to multiple locations, including one auto-sent email address to myself that would forward the files if I didn't manually stop it within 24 hours. This wasn't only about proving corruption anymore. It was about protection. Because I knew the HOA wouldn't stop. Within an hour, a new violation notice appeared on my doorstep, this one alleging unauthorized intrusion into HOA property. Another letter threatened immediate legal action for interference with board operations. They were panicking, throwing accusations at me blindly, hoping one would stick. They believed pressure and fear would force me to retreat. But they had no idea how far I was willing to go. Instead of responding, I prepared everything for a full report. My evidence wasn't speculative, it was irrefutable. I assembled the timeline of the missing fund, tracked the flow of money through shell accounts, and highlighted every signature connecting the board to the illegal transactions. I included homeowner complaints, financial inconsistencies, and the erased records they thought were gone forever. The report reached over 100 pages by the time I was finished. At dawn the next morning, I submitted the entire file to the state HOA regulatory office, the county attorney, and an investigative journalist who had previously covered corruption in homeowner associations. I knew once those three received it, the story wouldn't be buried, not even with all the HOA's money and influence. The fuse was lit. By afternoon, unmarked vehicles began circling the neighborhood. Plainclothes investigators quietly assessed the HOA office, collecting statements from residents, and requesting administrative access to financial systems. Homeowners stepped outside, confused as they saw investigators walking into the clubhouse where board meetings were normally held. The board president attempted to stop them, but her voice shook as she argued. Her confidence, so overwhelming just days before, crumbled under the weight of their questions. And the moment investigators presented the printed copies of the documents I had gathered, her face drained of all color. She tried denying everything. Then she tried justifying the fund. Then she claimed the missing money was part of a completed project. Every explanation contradicted the last. Neighbors watched as the investigators carried box after box of files out of the office. The same files the board had sworn did not exist. The same files homeowners had requested for years. Some neighbors whispered. Others stared in shock. A few cheered quietly under their breath. The unraveling continued for days. The local news arrived. Reporters asked questions the board refused to answer. Homeowners came forward with stories of fines, intimidation, and mysterious fees they had been afraid to challenge. And when the story broke publicly, it included everything: the fraudulent fund, the secret negotiations, the $10 million that had been siphoned out of the community. The headline spread across the county. HOA caught in $10 million fraud scheme, whistleblower homeowner exposes cover-up. The board president resigned immediately. The treasurer disappeared from the neighborhood overnight. Investigators froze the HOA's accounts and seized documents from the board members' homes. Months of pressure, manipulation, and harassment had led them to this moment, a collapse more complete than I could have imagined. The HOA was dismantled within weeks. New leadership was appointed under state supervision, and residents voted to dissolve most of the HOA's authority until a proper structure could be put in place. Homes that had been trapped under the board's control were finally freed from the constant threat of fines and intimidation. As the dust settled, neighbors approached me with gratitude. Some apologized for being silent. Others thanked me for doing what they had been too afraid to attempt. Many admitted they had suspected corruption but never believed anyone would uncover the truth. But the truth had been uncovered. And the HOA had been exposed down to its darkest corner. Standing on my porch one quiet afternoon, I realized something important: they had pushed me too far, but in doing so, they had made their biggest mistake. They believed fear would keep me quiet. They believed intimidation would keep me controlled. They believed no one would dare challenge a system so deeply rooted in secrecy. What they never expected was that one homeowner's persistence could topple their entire scheme. In the end, my final move didn't just expose the board, it protected the whole neighborhood. And the $10 million secret they fought so desperately to bury? It became the very evidence that destroyed them forever.